1099.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. Democrat City Council member Tawana Brown and her two daughters have been indicted by a federal grand jury for allegedly obtaining COVID-19 relief funds in a fraudulent nature. Tawana Brown, her daughters Tamija and Antony Rouse, all from Charlotte, have been charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud for allegedly submitting fraudulent applications to illegally obtain COVID-19 pandemic relief funds. This is according to U.S. Attorney Russ Ferguson for the Western District of North Carolina. The indictment reads in part, between April 2020 and September 2021, the defendants conspired to execute a wire fraud scheme to defraud the Small Business Administration, of course that's SBA, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, EIDL, and its Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, to obtain COVID-19 pandemic relief funds through the submission of loan applications containing false information or false documentation. The indictment goes on to say the false documentation generally included fake and fraudulent tax forms that lied about gross income and the number of employees, among other misrepresentations. Defendants also submitted false statements for PPP loan forgiveness. Defendants have submitted at least 15 applications to the various programs. Altogether, the indictment and the grand jury determined that the three secured more than $124,000 through fraudulent PPP and IEDL loans, with prosecutors alleging that they spent the majority of the funds on personal expenses, including luxury items from Louis Vuitton and a $15,000 lavish birthday party for the councilwoman, which featured a balloon wall, rose garden, and a throne and horse-drawn carriage. If convicted, they face a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison for each offense charged in the indictment itself. In a press release on Thursday, Brown insists that these alleged activities took places in the early stage of the pandemic and before she was a member of the Charlotte City Council. Brown also was asked about resigning from her position. She said she would not resign and does plan to run for re-election for her District 3 seat. During a Thursday press conference, Brown insisted that she had already paid back the loans and in a press release called it a political attack. She told reporters yesterday, quote, "There's some PPP loans out there that just came up that never touched the courtroom. So if it's about justice and I paid it back, why are we here? I paid it back on my own. No one had to tell me to do that." Brown had previously served several years in federal prison in her 20s on a felony fraud conviction and noted, "I am not here to be tried by the media. However, I must address these allegations against me by the U.S. District Court. I will have my day in court, and I trust the process." The three defendants are scheduled for an initial appearance in a Charlotte courtroom coming up today. The first appearance is around 10:40. All three of those individuals will be appearing before about 11:30 this morning. So this is obviously going to be a continued story. We'll continue to track the details not only here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, but of course as well on our website, carolinajournal.com. The headline this morning, we've got a link to the full indictment, is Charlotte City Council member indicted on federal charges. It's now 5:07. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was recently in the state of North Carolina visiting Fort Bragg. To get some additional details on that this morning, Teresa Opeka, CarolinaJournal.com, joins us on the News Hour. Teresa, Fort Bragg was Fort Liberty, now back to Fort Bragg. Pete Hegseth was there yesterday. What did he have to say to the troops that gathered up for that?
Sure. Good morning. Thanks for having me, Nick. So yeah, ahead of Memorial Day was a great time to go visit the troops. It was during the 82nd Airborne Division's All-American Week review. We'll get into that in a minute. He brought a message of support and encouragement, but even bigger news, pay raises. Who doesn't like a pay raise, right? So he was excited to be there to announce that. And like you just said, he mentioned, yeah, it's Fort Bragg. It's Fort Bragg again. He says, nothing wrong with liberty. Give me death. But give me Fort Bragg every day of the week. So he talked about that. talked about, getting the military back to basics by restoring the warrior ethos, focusing on readiness training, warfighting, accountability standards, you name it, and also being merit based, whether you're black, white, male, female. There was no more, DEI. It was strictly across the board as far as merits go. As far as the pay increases, getting to that here is, he said, we're taking care of our people. He says, it's not just about the training, it's about families and a historic investment in barracks and housing and healthcare and in pay. And the big increase is coming for E1 to E4 classifications. And in addition, jump pay, that's also known as hazardous duty incentive pay. That's for people also like paratroopers or people jump out of, the planes, stuff like that. They'll be getting an increase for the first time in 25 years. That's
Wow.
amazing. Yeah. So he says jump masters who have been compensated additionally for that additional duty, they're going to receive an additional $150 a month in incentive pay. So here's to our paratroopers, jump masters who do all the difficult things in difficult places that most Americans can never imagine. And I couldn't. So kudos to them, and well earned, definitely.
Yeah. Well, or no question about that, Teresa. Going back to some of his earlier comments, as we watch the process unfold on Capitol Hill a couple of months ago with his nomination and then, of course, his approval by the United States Senate, he talked a lot about returning to basics in military. And Teresa, there's been a lot of stories over the last couple of years about some of these standards being changed and various barriers being moved around and lifted as it related to readiness and what sort of training had to be gone through for various individuals. Hegseth seems to be hell-bent on keeping this back to just the basics of warfighting and making sure that the United States is ready. God forbid a situation unfolds.
Oh, absolutely. Like going back to what the military was built on and going back to those values. And, he talked about rebuilding the military, reestablishing deterrence after what he said the world watched and wondered where American leadership and American strength were under the Biden administration. He didn't reference them, by name, but when he talked through the attack in the nation's capital, which also occurred, I believe it was late Wednesday night, where the two Israeli embassy staffers were killed by an anti-Israel suspect. He also mentioned the war in Ukraine and also the attacks on October 7th against Israel. He mentioned all of that, and also the debacle of what happened in Afghanistan. I mean, who could forget that? So he said President Trump is putting America first, and we're going to reestablish peace through strength and reestablish deference. And when he said, when I look out at this formation, the eyes of men and women and these flags, he sees the eyes of deterrence and the eyes of American strength. So it was a very powerful message he gave, and something I think the soldiers haven't heard in quite a while.
Well, and visits to North Carolina, not only from people like Pete Hegseth, but from former presidents, with the major amount of military bases that we've got here and all of the work that goes on at Camp Lejeune and now, of course, at Fort Bragg that we're talking about. North Carolina's military presence, Teresa, is one of the largest in the entire United States.
You are correct. Yeah, we've got Cherry Point, Fort Bragg. I mean, you name it. There's so many military installations across the state. So North Carolina plays a vital role when it comes to the military and, sending out our brave men and women to protect our country and fight here at home or fight abroad. The Tar Heel State serves a very, very important role in the military, the U.S. military, absolutely, and they're to be commended for everything they do and all the bravery they do. Because, like as Pete Hegseth mentioned, can imagine a lot of people wanting to jump out of helicopters or planes or take on the responsibilities that they have, but they do that fearlessly, and they're in it. Hey, it's all volunteer, right? The draft ended, people are doing this, and you give them credit for doing what they do. And congratulations to all those brave men and women, especially coming upon Memorial Day weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. A great message ahead of Memorial Day weekend. Teresa, you've got some additional quotes and some links to some other things that Pete Hegseth talked about in his visit Thursday in North Carolina. Where can folks get those details this morning?
Sure, they can head on over to carolinajournal.com.
Teresa Opeka joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:13, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We will get a look at the roadways as we are kicking off your Memorial Day weekend. We'll take a look at traffic with Dave Hewitt.
Hey, good morning.
It's 521. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. We're keeping an eye on a lot of legislation that continues to move back and forth in the North Carolina General Assembly. Here's an interesting one for you this morning. North Carolina schools, under some new legislation, would be required to teach students about social media risks under that bill that is advancing in the legislature. Lawmakers are also trying to use measures to enact cell phone restrictions in the classrooms as well. We start off with House Bill 959, which passed a key Senate committee earlier this week on Wednesday, which would require schools to offer social media literacy lessons. They would educate students on social media's effects on health, including social, emotional, and physical effects. Students would learn about the consequences of social media use one time in elementary school, one time in middle school, and then twice again in high school. Schools would be required to teach them about social media addiction, misinformation, manipulation, cyberbullying, personal security, and the permanency of, posting things to the internet, among other things. It's one of several measures seeking to regulate social media use that has been working its way through the GA. Earlier this month, the House passed a bill that would ban social media accounts for children younger than 14. It would also require parental permission for 14 and 15-year-olds to use social media. As it stands right now, federal law requires a minimum age of 13 to create an account on most social media platforms. However, children can easily get around some of those restrictions. To address that, House Bill 301, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago, would allow the state to fine social media companies up to $50,000 each time a younger teen sets up an account. Families of teens who manage to get around the rules would also be allowed to sue the companies for up to $10,000. Another proposal, House Bill 462, seeks to ban anyone younger than 18 from using social media without parental permission, and requires all social media users to show ID to sign up for an account. That measure has stalled in the House before a key legislative deadline, meaning that it is unlikely to pass during the session and did not receive bipartisan support in the House. Members of the Senate Education Committee on Wednesday also amended a bill which had already passed through the House unanimously to include the Senate's preferred policy restricting cell phones as well as other electronic devices in the classroom. The Senate and House have each passed a bill that would restrict cell phone use in schools, but haven't negotiated on a compromise to which one they will ultimately enact. Though the broad concepts of restrictions are to reduce classroom distractions, does continue to have pretty wide bipartisan support. Both bills require school boards to pass system-wide policies cracking down on cell phones at a minimum. House Bill 87 focuses only on cell phones, while Senate Bill 55 requires schools to restrict electronic devices, including laptops or tablets, during instructional time. Both bills would have exemptions for when a teacher authorizes their use for instruction or for use in addressing a student's personal health or disability needs. The Senate bill has an additional exemption for when a teacher allows devices to be used in the event of an emergency. Democrat Governor Josh Stein has called for a cell phone restrictions in school. He did that during his State of the State address, which took place in March. Last month, he launched a new council to focus on student safety and well-being. One of its main priorities is examining cell phone use in the classroom. As we talk about electronic devices and social media, the Social Media Literacy Bill, House Bill 959, would also require school boards to pass policies that would prevent students from accessing inappropriate content and the short-form video app TikTok when using school internet or devices. Schools largely already have some filters in place, but this would mandate this from the GA. Other measures have targeted TikTok this session as well. Senate Bill 408, which passed the chamber earlier this month, would ban people from using TikTok or WeChat if they're using phones, tablets, Wi-Fi networks, or other property owned by state or any local government, which the school system would fall under. The apps have raised concerns with U.S. officials over their ties to the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. Former Governor Roy Cooper already has banned state employees from using TikTok and WeChat on government-owned devices. That came down in a 2023 executive order. However, that what we're talking about this morning, Senate Bill 408, would expand parts of that ban and make it a little bit more widespread if that was to go forward. So that is a lot of the legislation that we are tracking as it relates to social media, electronic devices, and social media outlets in the state of North Carolina. Most of those pieces of legislation did make it through the crossover deadline, which we have been keeping a very close eye on over the last couple of weeks, and it does seem like there could be some significant movement on that. Also, the concept that many of these various pieces of legislation that we're talking about, some of these various policy items, have a pretty strong possibility of making it into the budget negotiation process, which we have been covering as well. And with that taking place, we are continuing to track what has been a busy week from House Republicans as they voted on their 25-27 biennium budget proposal on Wednesday, just 2 days after the bill was introduced. And leaders are still cautiously optimistic that a final deal could be made by the summer. Representative Destin Hall saying during a press conference earlier this week, to sum up what this budget is about on the House side, we continue to give tax relief while also making sure we're investing in the state's most important asset, which we believe are its people. I'm hopeful and frankly optimistic that we'll be able to get a budget done this summer, and it's possible still that we'll get it done in the month of June. I know that that's my goal by the end of the day. With that, the House budget has been fully voted on and has been sent by special message to the Senate, where they will vote to not concur and will begin the official process of getting key leaders from the North Carolina House and the North Carolina Senate in the same room to negotiate that budget. House Speaker Destin Hall said, quote, "We're better than the governor's budget or the Senate on state employee raises. And so I imagine that many state employees themselves are happy with that part. Many of the jobs that are being cut have been unfilled now for a long time, many cases months or even years in some circumstances. These are positions that almost all of them are unfilled positions, and there's nothing stopping us from coming back later and adding these positions if a various department thinks that they need it. The budget includes a directive for state agencies to cut 20% of their long-term vacant positions. There are currently over 10,000 of those positions in North Carolina in the state government. Rather than eliminating these positions as a cost-saving measure, lawmakers reallocated the funds back to the agencies in form of flexible dollars for them to use. So that is one of the proposals that we are looking at as this debate does continue. We'll dive into some additional details on some of the Helene funding in that budget coming up here in just a few minutes. It's now 5:29 on the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time to get a look at the roadways this morning with Dave Hewitt.
Hey, good morning.
It's 5:36. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Keeping an eye on the General Assembly this morning. Since approving their initial budget proposal, the North Carolina Senate has begun advancing House bills for its current session with key additions from their chamber. One of the bills that the Senate pushed forward this week focuses on disaster relief and addresses concerns about political discrimination in the distribution of aid. This legislation comes after a FEMA worker was fired last fall for allegedly politically discriminating in disaster aid distribution for Hurricane Helene. The bill that the North Carolina senators approved in the Regulatory Reform Committee on Wednesday is House Bill 251. It aims to ensure that such bias doesn't influence emergency relief efforts. The bill passed the House last month in a 106-10 vote, very much bipartisan support there. Representative Kelly Hastings, the Republican out of Gaston County, noted, "I guess it's important to explain why we're here to begin with. I read this article about a FEMA worker who allegedly was eventually fired because they were instructing people not to provide services based on their political speech. And in this instance, the political speech was a yard sign for now President Donald Trump." As reported in November, Hastings recounted FEMA workers were instructed not to grant assistance because that person was showing their political affiliation and expressing political speech. He said that brings on strict scrutiny when the government tries to restrict political speech, which is the most protected speech in America. With Representative Hastings adding, "So that's when it hit us that there are a number of ways that people could discriminate, and so that's why we're here today with this bill." The House bill is now the vehicle for a package of 4 unanimously passed Senate disaster relief bills, marking a strategic consolidation effort by lawmakers. Senators added an amendment to House Bill 251 that incorporated 4 Senate bills that directly address disaster response, recovery, and infrastructure relief in the wake of Hurricane Helene and other emergencies. Senator Tom McGinnis, the Republican out of Moore County, during the committee meeting said all 4 of those bills passed the Senate unanimously. What we're doing now is just consolidating these so that we can have them in one vehicle to move everything in one expedited manner. The amendments written in the latest version include Senate Bill 164, theft or temporary housing during an emergency. It creates a criminal penalty for theft or damage to temporary housing during a declared emergency to ensure that displaced families have a secure house safe from bad actors. Senate Bill 266, that's the Historic Flood Event Building Code exemption. In response to the historic flooding brought by Hurricane Helene, this bill provides flexibility for rebuilding in designated flood zones. It temporarily exempts affected properties from certain building code provisions, allowing faster recovery while continuing to maintain essential safe standards. Senate Bill 445 is dealing with hospitals. It recognizes hospitals as a critical lifeline during various natural disasters and crises. The bill reduces red tape for healthcare facilities in some of those zones. It allows hospitals to respond more efficiently and rebuild quickly without being hamstrung by standard regulatory requirements, as well as some other building code exemptions as well. Altogether, the bills passed in the House and the Senate committees discussed were the REINS Act, though they did not take a vote on the bill. Under this legislation, under the REINS Act, if a regulation created by officials in the executive branch has a significant amount of economic impact, upwards of $1 million, then the North Carolina General Assembly would have a statutory role in approving those proposed rules. We've got a lot of details on all of these pieces of legislation this morning. All of that is available on our website, carolinajournal.com. We have been talking a lot this week about the North Carolina House budget proposal, which came out Monday night. One of the big things in discussion does continue to be Hurricane Helene relief and recovery for Western North Carolina. To get some additional details on that this morning, Brianna Kramer, carolinajournal.com, joins us on the News Hour. Brianna, the state has already allocated more than $1.6 billion for hurricane relief. Some members in the House are trying to allocate another $500 million. However, they're taking some money away from a previous project they funded. There's a lot of moving parts this morning. What's the latest that you're tracking?
Hey, Nick. Yes, that's right. The North Carolina House passed the Disaster Recovery Act of 2025, Part 2, on Thursday. And this is a bill that would appropriate over $450 million for Western North Carolina. But where do these funds come from is the question. As part of this funding model, the Act claws back $500 million from the nonprofit group NC Innovation. And this is the private-public partnership group that was created to bolster the commercialization of research across the UNC system. And so within this bill, the House is directing NC Innovation to give back $500 million, and they want to completely cut ties with NC Innovation.
Yeah, and you mentioned this idea of taking research that comes out of various UNC schools that taxpayers are essentially already funding as they fund the UNC system through the state budget anyway. This entity is set to try and commercialize some of that. Brina, it was just a couple of years ago that lawmakers seemed to think that this was a great idea. Now here we are in the budget talks and budget negotiations. They're trying to take that money back. Accurate to say there's more pressing issues going on in the state now, and they see this as a large sum of money that they can reallocate?
Yeah, well, this certainly is a large sum of money. And actually, both chambers, the House and Senate, are trying to take back most of this money, actually. So we're seeing a unified effort on both sides, slightly different. But on the House side, they included it in their budget. That came out this week. And then also in this bill, this Hurricane Helene relief bill that passed on Thursday. So it's in two different pieces of legislation in the House. And then on the Senate side, in their Senate budget proposal last month, they wanted to claw back $500 million and then appropriate $100 million to NC Innovation over the next 4 years or so. So we're seeing this is unified in both chambers wanting to take this money, and both of them actually are redirecting the money to different efforts.
Let's talk about this legislation that was discussed yesterday in the North Carolina House. How do lawmakers intend to spend this $500 million that they're talking about?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different areas. They're trying to continue in the recovery process out in Western North Carolina. So some of the big points in this bill, $70 million is appropriated from the state to match critical federal recovery programs. So, the continued work with federal agencies and the matches, I think that's something that the state, continues to have to work on in order to get as much money they can from the federal government as well. $60 million is going to the small business disaster grants. And so that will allow small businesses to get up to $100,000. $50 million is allocated for local governments to fulfill unmet and unreimbursed capital needs. And then there's a bunch of other funding projects as well: debris removal, reconstruction of schools, airport infrastructure, just an array of needs that still need to be addressed out there.
Brent, if I'm remembering back to our conversations a couple of months ago, as the lawmakers have now passed multiple pieces of legislation as it relates to helping the folks out west get back to some semblance of normalcy, lawmakers seemed to indicate at the time that they were not going to pass another standalone relief bill, and they could do the rest of the funding inside the budget. Do we have any details from House leaders as to why they chose to split this out from the budget and not included in that process that is ongoing right now between the House and the Senate?
Well, when they did pass the hurricane relief bill a few months ago, that was called the Disaster Recovery Act of 2025, Part 1. So we were assuming that more was yet to come, and they did say that they will continue. This is a pressing need the governor has mentioned, and leaders of both the House and Senate. So this is something everybody, doesn't matter what side of the political aisle you're on, has planned to continue funding. So whether that's within the budget or within this standalone bill, I think it's kind of more of a backup this week. the House having it in a bill and also in the budget, because now for the budget, they have to go negotiate with the Senate. And speaking of the Senate bill allocates $700 million. So there's a lot of negotiations that need to go on, because obviously both chambers are not aligning completely on the total funding, first of all, and then exactly how this money is pulled. The House wants to pull it from NC Innovation, but the Senate wants to use NC Innovation's money to build a children's hospital. So there's definitely some discrepancies that need to be worked out in the weeks ahead.
And of course, our audience is familiar with some news that we covered last week. Governor Josh Stein is asking for somewhere in the tune of $900 million for funding. So, Brandon, we've got a whole bunch of different dollar figures here, and I guess accurate to say maybe a little bit of a power struggle as it relates to the different branches of government here in North Carolina.
Certainly. So the different leaders in office and what exactly their priorities are. So we'll have to wait and see how Speaker of the House, Destin Hall, and Senate President Phil Berger come together in the weeks ahead to negotiate the budget, and then ultimately also work with Governor Josh Stein.
We'll obviously keep a very close eye on that. Brandon, we do have a rundown of pretty much every dollar that the House wants to spend on relief in a story this morning. Where can folks go and read some additional details on that?
Yeah, you can head to carolinajournal.com to read the latest there.
Brianna Kramer joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:48, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Another look at the roadways this morning with Dave Hewitt.
Really good shape out.
Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. We are recapping one of our big stories this morning. It surrounds a member of the Charlotte City Council, Democrat member there, Tawana Brown, and her two daughters have been indicted by a federal grand jury for allegedly obtaining COVID-19 relief funds in a fraudulent nature. Her and her two daughters, all based in Charlotte, have been charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud for allegedly submitting fraudulent applications to illegally obtain COVID-19 pandemic relief funds. All of this is according to U.S. Attorney Russ Ferguson, who is for the Western District of North Carolina. The indictment reads, in part, between April of 2020 and September of 2021, the defendants conspired to execute a wire fraud scheme to defraud the Small Business Administration, Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, and its Paycheck Protection Program, all of that to obtain COVID-19 pandemic relief funds through the submission of a loan application containing false information or false documentation. The indictment goes on to say the false documents generally included fake and fraudulent tax forms that lied about gross income and the number of employees, among other misrepresentations. Defendants also submitted false statements for the PPP loan forgiveness program, and it accuses them of submitting at least 15 applications to try and get some of those funds. Altogether, the three secured more than $124,000 through the fraudulent loan programs, with prosecutors alleging that they spent the majority of the funds on personal expenses, including luxury items from Louis Vuitton and a $15,000 lavish birthday party for the councilwoman featuring a throne and a horse-drawn carriage. If convicted, they face a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison for each offense charged in the indictment. In a press release on Thursday, Brown insists that these alleged activities took place during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic and before she was a member of the Charlotte City Council. Brown also told reporters yesterday that she will not resign from her position and that she plans to run for re-election for her District 3 seat. During a Thursday press conference, Brown insisted that she had already paid the loans back and in some cases called it a politically motivated attack. She told the reporters, "There's some PPP loans out there that just came up that never touched the courtroom. So if it's about justice and I paid it back, then why are we here? I paid it back on my own. No one had to tell me to do that." Brown had previously served several years in a federal prison in her 20s on a felony fraud conviction and said, quote, "I'm not here to be tried by the media. However, I must address these allegations against me by the United States District Court. I will have my day in court, and I trust the process." The three defendants, including the Charlotte City Council member, are scheduled for an initial appearance in a Charlotte courtroom coming up this morning. They will be in a little after 10 o'clock for their first appearance. This is set to be a very interesting story to follow and watch unfold. We'll continue to track the details on our website, carolinajournal.com. As we look at what has been a busy week in the North Carolina General Assembly, with that, House and Senate lawmakers are set to take a little bit of a break for the Memorial Day weekend. They will not be in session at all next week, and we'll be back in the first full week of June to continue working on all of the various pieces of legislation that we have discussed. Also, the negotiation process is really set to get started between the North Carolina House and Senate as they work out details between the two chambers as to coming up with their finalized budget to send to Governor Josh Stein's desk. They do hope and do plan to try and have those budget negotiations done in the month of June. That's something that the General Assembly has struggled with in the past. We'll keep an eye on it on carolinajournal.com. Well, that's going to do it for a Friday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back with you a Tuesday morning live, 5 to 6, right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.